Welcome. I'm Patricia Kranz, Executive Director of the Overseas Press Club of America. Tonight we're hosting Alice Driver, the author of Life and Death of the American Worker, the immigrants taking on America's largest meatpacking company. Last year in 2024, the book won the Lukas Work-in-Progress Prize from the Columbia Journalism School and the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard. The book begins with a deadly chemical accident at a Tyson processing plant in 2011, which the company quickly covered up. Alice was able to gain the trust of the immigrant workers who survived the horrific incident and its aftermath. Alice has been a member of the OPC since 2017. She grew up in the Ozark Mountains in Arkansas. She's working on a memoir, The Letters, Maurice Sendak, A Girl and a Lifelong Friendship, which will come out in 2026. It's about her family's relationship with Maurice Sendak, the author of course, we all know Where the Wild Things Are. This year, Alice will attend the Rockefeller Foundation's Bellagio Center residency. In 2024, she won the Donald Robinson Memorial Award for Investigative Journalism for her work at Civil Eats on agricultural workers. In 2023, she won a James Baird Award for investigative reporting. She writes for The New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, Oxford American, and National Geographic. Alice also teaches a workshop on gender-based violence for journalists in El Salvador through the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State. Speaking tonight with Alice is Yafa Frederick, the Senior Director of Investigations and High Impact Reporting for the Houston Chronicle. Yafa joined the Chronicle in 2023 after serving as a senior editor at CNN Digital, where she managed breaking political news and opinion coverage. She previously served as the Chronicle's local government editor. Prior to joining CNN, Yafa worked as an editor at the African Network of Centers for Investigative Reporting, where she coordinated over 20 African newsrooms in their reporting of the Pulitzer Prize-winning Panama Papers. She has been a member of the OPC for over 10 years. Alice and Yafa will talk 20 to 30 minutes and then take questions. Please put your questions in the chat. The program is being recorded and will be posted on the OPC's YouTube channel and on our website. I now turn it over to Yafa. Thank you both.
Thank you so much, Patricia. And thank you, Alice, so much for joining. I was really privileged to be able to read this book and sort of think deeply about it. So I'm excited for this conversation with you. I'm going to jump right in if that's okay, Alice.
Oh, thank you, Yafa. Yeah.
So you've been writing about the challenging work conditions in America's meatpacking plants for a while. We worked on stories together at CNN about this. But what really prompted you to turn years of investigative work into a book at this moment in time?
Well, I think with any book, there's a lot of factors that come into play, and I definitely didn't plan for this to be a book. When the pandemic hit in 2020, I was based in Mexico City, even though I'm from Arkansas. I had been based there for many years, covering migration mostly and labor issues. And I had in mind that I wanted to do a story about the meatpacking industry, but I had not gotten funding for it, which is kind of the, the life of a freelance journalist, which, you're familiar with. I've worked with you for almost 10 years, I think, as an editor, which has really been a privilege. And so I got funding in the beginning of the pandemic. I immediately applied for funding from the National Geographic Society, and I got it. And I came to Arkansas to write what was initially one article for the Arkansas Times newspaper. And then, as the pandemic progressed, meatpacking workers who I'd started following, some of them began to die of COVID. And so I continued following the story and applying for funding. And it was a very, very challenging time for everyone, and for me as a freelancer. I got COVID while reporting this story, and then I couldn't work because I had long COVID, and then I ended up moving with my parents. Anyways, this is just to say that the book came about almost by surprise, because I published an article in the New York Review of Books, and within about a week of publishing that article, I had both contact from agents and from publishers. It was kind of like a confluence, because at that time I didn't have an agent. And so I got to work on a book proposal, and it sold at auction. So there were multiple bidders. Anyway, it was all a surprise to me that there was so much interest in labor during the pandemic.
Yeah. Well, I think as we get into this, maybe our audience will understand why there's so much interest. But I want to start off with the first thing I thought about when I even saw the book before I'd read your foreword, which is this feels like the jungle set 100 years later. I mean, Upton St. Clair's book was so significant in documenting kind of those early unionizing efforts. And yet somehow when reading this book, you look at the sort of abysmal conditions under which these workers work and think like, wasn't this supposed to change? Didn't we have unionization and laws that were supposed to protect workers? So can you explain to us like why this breaks down in Tyson and specifically in Springdale, where so many of these workers are? Why are the protections that in theory, decades before, documented and fought for, not actually applying to these folks?
That's a great question, and I think it has to do with Arkansas and with the South, and which Arkansas is very ignored state, but it's a testing ground for so many laws, especially related to labor. And it's also the home of the largest meatpacking company in the United States, which is Tyson. So people ask me, why do you write about Tyson? Why didn't you write about, one of the other companies? But I wrote about Tyson because it's the largest company and because it's headquartered in my home state, which is really a state that has tested some of the most lax legislation in terms of labor. It was the first state to pass right to work legislation in 1944, along with Florida, Arkansas and Florida. And right to work legislation essentially says, we don't want any unions. And in my book, you can read about different, quotes from different higher ups at Tyson saying equally that they don't want unions. They basically say Tyson's a family and they're going to take care of their workers like a family, things like that. There's a whole lot of sort of this use of terms around like family and how we're going to take care of you, and also definitely sort of evangelical Christian things tied up in how you should, have faith and work hard. And so it's really interesting to look at Arkansas and the South in that way, because it's legislation that's been passed in other states. And you can see this right now in Arkansas with child labor legislation. Arkansas last year lowered, or in 2023, lowered the age of work to 14.
Wow. Well, I think that sort of ties in a little bit to the next question that I had, because one of the quotes you have early in the book is, "Nothing is more American than meatpacking." And yet most of the workers we meet are not American born. So can you, for lack of a better pun, unpack for us what you mean that meatpacking is hand in hand with sort of the history of America in so many ways?
Yeah, I mean, even for me, this political moment, because my book really is dealing with the first Trump administration, and we're about to enter the second. And if you look at ideas of masculinity, especially with anything online, TikTok, Instagram, Reels, viral content about masculinity and men and protein, it's incredible. I mean, and that's just, the current political moment about what it means to be strong and to be a leader and to be a man is very much tied up in meat. And you can extend that to Jeff Bezos and all that, Zuckerberg and their obsession now with muscles and protein and all these things. So in terms of the political moment that I was working in, I really was interested in that. And you can look at different time periods in the way that meat has defined the United States or defined masculinity. And so for me, that was something that, despite, you know, the offerings of different plant-based companies and stuff, we're still very much a country that's tied up and connected to the meatpacking industry.
Yeah. And you see that that idea kind of reiterated by the Tyson managers of why it's so important for these workers to be there during COVID. Like depriving Americans of their meat is the worst thing that we could do at the sort of the height of COVID. So let's get into the people who really are the backbone of your book. I mean, you interviewed so many of these migrant workers, Mexican, Guatemalan, El Salvadorian, Karen, Samoan. I mean, they're an amazing group of undocumented folks who we meet from all over the world, not just Central American. How did you begin to build relationships, build their trust? I mean, taking on Tyson is not an easy thing to do. It's very intimidating. And we'll get into it, I mean, they have sort of everyone, all the powers that be in their court. So how do you go about the reporting process of this, of actually building trust with people and getting them to really be candid about their kind of nightmare experiences?
Well, I started out, because when I started reporting this, I was reporting via phone because it was, you know, when we still weren't really sure what COVID was and how it was spreading and all of that. So I was contacting Arkansas organizations that work with immigrants and asking, do you know anyone who would want to speak to me anonymously? Because I knew I couldn't use their names. And if you read the book, the only people in the book who use their real names are either dead or no longer work for Tyson. It's a very serious and difficult. I had no idea how difficult it was going to be. But so I started contacting people who are willing to speak to me anonymously. And then eventually I started trying to meet up with people. And I really gained traction when I met up and interviewed the director of an organization called Venceremos, which is central to my book. It's a worker-led organization founded by 16 immigrant women who work in the poultry processing industry. And that's where I really started meeting workers, and they wanted to share their stories because they were organizing around several key workplace safety issues, and they wanted their stories to be heard. And the rest of it was me driving around Arkansas during COVID, interviewing people, meeting them in person. I mean, we're talking about people who are, you know, they're not on email, they're maybe not texting, they're maybe not even, they haven't paid their phone bill. It was a lot of really in-person work, and especially because some of the workers are illiterate, it's just a different, it requires a different level of reporting and commitment.
Yeah. And I mean, you do a remarkable job of it, how open, I mean, people are with you is sort of a testament to your skills and to your language skills. I mean, how many reporters in Arkansas are fluent in Spanish, for example, and can actually do these interviews in that language? I mean, that's one of the tension points in Tyson, the managers and the workers not being able to communicate, and Tyson not making any real efforts to translate documentation or anything for these workers. So let's talk about the forces that are sort of conspiring against these workers a little bit. The way I sort of saw it as I was reading the book, you have the political forces, which are very bipartisan in a lot of ways, and historically have been in Arkansas going back to the Bill Clinton days. You have local media that isn't actually doing super critical coverage. And then you have COVID itself that becomes this force that's larger than life and really sort of takes over this book and puts Tyson under the microscope in a new way. Can you talk a little bit about these political forces, the media ones, and then, you know, we'll get into the meat of COVID after that.
Yeah, it was really important to me to focus on the bipartisan support for the meatpacking industry, the power of the lobbying, because it's not a partisan issue in terms of support. And it was also interesting to me, once again, because Bill Clinton, who was governor of Arkansas, a two-time governor, and became president, was a close friend of the Tyson family. And that's history that I feel like I was discovering in terms of, you know, them driving around in Don Tyson's Bentley together, all these kinds of good old boy activities and parties and flying around in the private jet. I think that's important to revisit, and also puts the focus not on one party or another, but on safety in an industry that's very dangerous and that affects a huge number of workers in the United States. And so I really wanted to explore that, especially because of the connection to Arkansas.
Yeah, and it's quite powerful. And as I was reading this book, I was actually looking up campaign contributions of Tyson, and I mean, it's incredible. Like they play every side of the aisle, up and down the ballot, so they have this sort of iron hold on it. But let's talk about COVID, because as Patricia alluded to at the beginning of the book, we're introduced to this chemical explosion at the plant that weakens a lot of these workers and actually makes them even more susceptible to the worst effects of COVID, ultimately killing one of them. What safety guards does Tyson have? And was there a shift during COVID? I mean, just fill people in a little bit more on the details. I'd love to flesh out like what Tyson was doing and what they weren't doing.
Mm-hmm. So the interesting thing for me was I started reporting this at the beginning of COVID, and I was really focusing on what is happening during COVID. I had no plans to go talk about a chemical accident or anything like that. But what happened was that several of the workers who died of COVID, Tyson workers, had been in a chemical accident that they discovered over time, destroyed their lungs. And so it was, for me, a way to connect the horrors of the COVID time period with, earlier issues with safety at Tyson, in terms of how they're managing chemicals. A lot of it has to do also with how they're managing training and translation. Imagine having workers who speak 20 or 30 different languages in one plant. And and you have a lot of, in this case, the chemicals when mixed produced a weapons grade, agent that harmed a lot of workers. And so there's a lot of issues related to translation, to training, but also to enforcement. When it comes to OSHA fines, the fines during COVID for violation of COVID protocols and regulations were maybe, like, one plant in Colorado was fined $15,500. So if many workers are dying of COVID, but the fine is $15,500, what is that saying to companies like Tyson?
And I think one of the more insidious parts of this, you talk about in the book about Tyson sort of controlling the whole vertical process of, from farm to slaughterhouse, if you will. But they do a similar thing with their workers. And as their workers get sick, and I mean, this was the part that was just shocking to me. It's like they had to go to Tyson nurses who were not prone to give them honest medical assessments. And then when things did escalate, they had to go to Tyson doctors. And I mean, even with this chemical explosion, the only reason they start to learn how damaged their lungs are, one of the guys who dies, is because he actually does go to a doctor who's outside of the Tyson network. Like, Tyson's tentacles in this seem unprecedented to me, but it was just this, like, we're going to control every element of this person, including their medical records, and use it. And this is, I guess, to come back to this, to kind of skirt some of the OSHA rules. I mean, there are guidelines on reporting injuries on site. So how did Tyson get around them? You can dive into that.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a great question, because the way that they do that with a lot of difficult issues is they have third-party providers. And so when I was interviewing workers, and I didn't know anything about the on-site medical clinics, workers would tell me, "Oh, that Tyson nurse," and I was thinking, who is a Tyson nurse? And so I started looking into it, and I had also, once again, it wasn't something I was planning on writing about. But I started getting into it, and of course Tyson says, we don't have nurses, we don't have doctors, we have a third-party provider. But what happens is that workers, if they want to go outside of the on-site system, they have to pay for it themselves, which for many is just something that they can't do. And so I had a real breakthrough when I got a Tyson nurse who had worked at several Tyson plants. She was an on-site nurse, what workers would call a Tyson nurse, to speak to me. And it was one of the hardest things I've ever done to get her to get anybody. I contacted many people and no one wanted to speak to me. But she said, look, we do our best, but we are here. When we're treating workers, we have managers and supervisors from Tyson who are not medically trained, who are weighing in on what we should be doing. And they receive bonuses if we keep injuries down.
Yeah, it's a real cooking of the books in a way that ultimately does lead in some cases to death. So I want to come back to that Placido who loses one of his lungs in that chemical explosion. The other one's damaged, and then he gets COVID and dies. And his wife, Angelina, becomes a really central character in your book because she kind of picks up that torch. She leaves Tyson, and she's one of those people who does speak more candidly to you. She gets involved with Venceremos, and she starts to look into what organizing looks like. So let's talk about that organizing piece of it. What I found really interesting was that they do this field trip to Florida to learn sort of best practices, labor union practices there. Was that a turning point, do you feel, for them? Because ultimately we get to a lawsuit, which we'll come back to in a second. What role and how impactful is Venceremos in a place like this where people are afraid to talk, afraid to be named, sort of operate in the shadows? How do you take on the man in a situation like this?
Venceremos has really changed the landscape of Arkansas. I mean, since I started working on this 4 years ago, for the first time in my life, I saw 2 workers speak publicly about their experience at Tyson. I mean, I think that's never happened in this state ever.
Yeah.
And that was at a Venceremos event that when I presented my book, 2 of the workers shared their stories. And so what they're doing is really important, but it's also been extremely difficult. And so Venceremos did organize a trip to the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in Florida, which is a very successful, it's organization run by agricultural workers in Florida that has really created a model in which workers educate other workers and put pressure on companies and consumers to make better decisions or decisions that will improve labor conditions. And so Arkansas workers, some of them had never been on a plane. Some of them, many first, but none of them had ever seen organizers, workers marching publicly, speaking, in the coalition has their own Spanish radio station. They produce, their own news stories and share story. Just things that in Arkansas would be absolutely unheard of and impossible. And so workers, it just felt like a real turning point in that sense, that they could see that this kind of organizing was possible and could create change.
And you write about shortly after the lawsuit. So maybe you can tell us about the lawsuit that gets filed against Tyson, and we'll talk about sort of the outcome of the lawsuit next.
Yeah, so the lawsuit, when I was following, as after workers died and some families received, $650,000 in medical bills, because this was not, it wasn't a slow death. Many of these deaths meant spending months in the hospital on a ventilator, and all of these kinds of things. And so workers started to organize. They wanted justice for these deaths, specifically because the company, workers who died and their families said that Tyson asked workers to continue working while testing positive for COVID. So these outbreaks, because meatpacking companies were the largest site of COVID outbreak aside from prisons, these outbreaks were preventable. But it was, it's hard to prove that because Arkansas, like many states, passed, it's called limited liability legislation, which meant that no company was responsible for anything related to COVID. And so workers could not sue for wrongful death. They had to come up with another lawsuit, and they sued for affliction of emotional damage and distress, which, at the time it was interesting to me. I was looking into other cases of like that, and talking to lawyers. I had a lot of lawyers in my life. And so eventually over several years, they finally filed the lawsuit, which they then lost.
So what was the reaction when they lost the suit? I mean, they are learning organizing principles, they're filing lawsuits within the constraints of the state that they're operating in, and then they lose. Did they feel like they still had fight in them? Was there a sense of, dejected and we give up? Sort of where are the organizing efforts now?
Well, it was really hard because workers said that the lawyer in charge of the case had told them that they would definitely win, which is, probably something you shouldn't be saying as a lawyer. So they were quite upset about it because they felt that they had been told that they would win this case. And they won, and some of them wondered if Tyson had somehow influenced that. But that's something that they wonder with a lot of things. So they were, a lot of workers were quite upset about it. And I think some, took some time maybe away from organizing. But Vince Ramos has continued doing really, really incredible work around child labor, which is the current pressing issue, not only in Arkansas, but in the US, just because it's also a central part of Project 2025 and the incoming Trump administration, and legislation that is, that has been passed in Arkansas that is being used as a blueprint for other states to really promote child labor.
No, it is hard to fully comprehend. I am curious because I want to leave time, of course, for questions from folks here. One last question that I had, though, since the book has come out, have you heard from Tyson? And what have you heard from the workers as well in presenting their stories back to them?
Well, I have heard from Tyson only in the sense that, for example, the New Yorker published a short review of the book, and their fact checkers asked Tyson for a response, and it says something, Tyson says most of this book is not true, or it's something like that. So that's the response I've gotten from them. And in terms of workers, the first thing workers ask me is, why isn't this in Spanish? Because, at this point they can't read it, in English. And so I published one chapter in Spanish, and I sent that to workers, and they've been really, really supportive and continued to work with me. I'm working on a podcast in Spanish related to the book. And so I'm just thankful that they have been able to do that, because I know that it's extremely emotional and difficult for them to continue talking about some of these issues.
And I mean, one of the things, Alice, you do so well, and I can say that sort of looking at the arc of our time working together, is giving voice to the voiceless, which this book is really just the epitome of. So definitely encourage folks to read it. But I'm going to turn it over to Chad to see if there are questions from folks here that we can share now.
Yes, we do have a couple of questions. The first one's from William Holstein, who asks, what happens if thousands of these workers get deported under Trump's second term?
A lot of news organizations have been calling me in recent months asking this very question. And it's going to be interesting because studies show that anywhere from 20 to 50% of the meatpacking workforce is undocumented. I think it's a little bit difficult to confirm the exact numbers, but it's, it is a significant part of the labor force in the meatpacking industry. And if they are deported, I mean, I think it's going to be there's going to be real tension between companies and this administration, because it's hard to get people to do that work, and especially at the wages that are being offered. And companies don't want to raise those wages. So what's going to happen? Are we going to pay more for meat? Which is, that was one of the big, what was said to be the big issue in this election was the cost of basic food, meat and eggs. And so are we going to see a huge jump in the price of meat? Are we going to see a decrease in production? Are we going to see companies paying more so that they can get workers to take on this kind of work? And I think those are real questions that that people should be considering when they think about deporting the people who are upholding our food system, many of whom have been here for most of their lives, if not all.
All right, we have another question from Jean. Are these undocumented workers organizing across states and corporations in the meatpacking industry?
I'm not aware of coordinated organizing across states, at least in the meatpacking industry. That's not to say it's not occurring with undocumented workers. But I would, that's a very good question. I would be curious to know. I think it's the hardest, obviously, for undocumented workers to organize, because often you're dealing with groups of people who speak many different languages, who do not speak English, who are often illiterate. And so organizing just takes on a new dimension when you're figuring out how to coordinate people who speak many different languages and who are not literate.
Well, we just had another question pop in from Larry. After your reporting on workers at Tyson, have you heard stories from workers for other companies?
I mean, I've heard stories from other companies. In Arkansas, there's several different meatpacking companies here, because when I started this reporting, I was interviewing workers at many different companies in the state. And so some of the stories, one of the issues with industry is that it's a consolidated industry. There's very few players. And so Tyson is the biggest, but you could also say it sets the pace, it sets the standard, and many companies are similar, in the way that they run things. And so part of the issue is that we need to break up the consolidated power of the meatpacking industry.
And another question from William. If not Spanish speaking, where are they all from? Where are the others from?
I mean, in Arkansas, we have the largest population in the world outside of the Marshall Islands. Marshallese, they work at Tyson in their majority. We have a community of refugees from Myanmar, the Karen, and then I've seen workers from Vietnam, Thailand. I mean, it's the Congo. There really is a large a variety of refugees and refugee and immigrant workers.
And Jean asked, is there a Spanish language translation in the works?
The rights are, my agent is working on selling the rights, and I do hope that this podcast that I'm working on in Spanish will help that move forward. So that, my greatest hope is that workers will be able to read it in Spanish.
That's sort of related to Larry's question. You mentioned you were working on a Spanish speaking podcast. Will that podcast be available in English too? And does it have a title?
It doesn't have a title yet. We're writing the script right now. I've finished the reporting, and I should know more in the next month or two. And I don't know. We'll see if, I mean, I would love to do a partnership to have it in English, but it's kind of up in the air at the moment, given given finishing up the Spanish one, but I hope so.
That's wrapped up the questions we have in chat right now. If anyone has any other questions, please do jot them down in the chat and we'll get to them.
And maybe if I can throw one in there while folks are thinking of any final questions. I think, Alice, one of the interesting tension points I've been thinking about heading into the Trump administration is that Tyson is so dependent on undocumented labor, and they are so politically influential. Could they potentially actually temper some of these deportation efforts? Could Tyson almost be the good guy in a weird way in that storyline?
I think that's a great question, and I would love to see more reporting on it because I cannot imagine that that Tyson or other companies are going to silently watch their labor force be deported. They know the financial cost of that.
Right.
And so it's going to be a point of tension, and I'll be really curious to see how it plays out with the incoming Trump administration.
Chat is silent at the moment. Oh, we have one. Thank you from Larry. Thank you, Alice, for your very important work on this issue. Other than the podcast, is there another topic you will be reporting on?
I am starting a new project on child labor, which is related to the meatpacking industry. I'm working on an article for the New York Review of Books. And so that is, you know, in the initial stages.
Yeah. And I'm sure other states, including the one I'm in Texas, are looking very closely at the Arkansas child labor law, determining if it's something that they can replicate here, where we also have meatpacking plants as well. Well, Alice, thank you so much, for writing the book and taking the time to talk to us today. And thank you so much to OPC for hosting this event. I strongly encourage, like OPC has in the comments, to buy the book. It is beautifully and heartbreakingly written, and it's a really easy read. I believe my mom's watching and she saw me read it all in basically a day. So
Oh, thank you, Yafa, and thanks to OPC. Thank you for being a wonderful editor and for doing this. I really appreciate it.
of course.